4. You are in the Zoom meeting now.
We're good to go.
All right, are we ready to go ahead and start? All right, everybody, thank you for being here today. My name is Joseph Cazier. I'm the director of the Center for Analytics Research and Education at Appalachian State University. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the analysis that we've been doing on the Partway home data set. And so you can see it's not just me. There's a team of several of our faculty and care staff and employees have been working diligently over the last while to put this together. And the focus of this presentation is really about developing a predictive model to try to help and better predict in advance who's going to return and graduate, who's going to stop out, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through. Okay, and so here's our agenda. Brief few seconds about us, a little bit about the data and the project, and then we're going to look at the results. I do have a lot of slides in here on the model comparison and statistics and other things that we did. Those are in an appendix at the end. I'm happy to share those with you. But we're going to focus on the results today unless it comes up in any questions. Okay. So a little bit about us. So here's our center. Our mission here is to do analytics for good. And so we have a few main areas that we work in. One of those is educational attainment analytics. We also do a lot around sustainability, economic development, health sciences, but things that we believe in. And this is a project we've been very excited about. You know, what's better than helping people finish college for economic development, educational outcomes, all kinds of things for the state. And so we're excited to share kind of what we have today. Again, there's our staff that helped work on this. And so first, let's talk a little bit about the data that we have and make sure we all have the same definitions and that we're all on the same page in that. Okay. And so we defined a Partway home student as somebody who had at least one stop out where they took at least one semester off during their senior year. And this was somebody that was more or less halfway to graduation, so they made it at least to a junior year with a GPA that would be plausible for them to have graduated had they stayed. So at least for us, that's at least a 2.0 GPA for most programs in the state. And really, this is part of a larger project where we looked at 4 what we call target variables or variables of interest. Can we predict when somebody's going to take a semester off? Can we predict if they're going to return? 6-year and 8-year graduation rate. In the interest of time and also for relevance, we're going to focus on the graduation rate and mostly on the 6-year rate. I'll explain why in a few moments. That will be the focus as we go forward. Additionally, as we look at the data, this covers all Partway home students in the entire UNC system. So if they took classes anywhere at one of the 16 UNC university campuses from fall 2003 and fall 2016, and they meet the definition of a Partway home student on the previous slide, so they reached senior status, they had at least a 2.0 GPA, and they took off at least one semester. They're in this data set, which has 350,000 student records that has about 52,000 unique students that were analyzed over a 12, 13-year time period. So that's a reasonable amount of time data to look at them. And so again, what we want to do is if we're trying to get a handle for this presentation on both the 6-year and on the 8-year graduation rates, then we have to give them enough time from when they started at the university to have had 6 years to have graduated from their matriculation semester. And so out of this, in our 6-year students, they started between fall 2003 and 10, giving us 6 years between the fall 2016 data, and the 8-year students we had to cut off a little bit before 2008 so that they would have had 8 years to graduate, that we would have had data to see from their first semester if they would have graduated. And so there's about 34,000 here and about 20,000 students here that were eligible to have graduated in that window of time. Okay? And also one important note, the 8-year students, we wanted to tell the difference between both of these groups. So the 8-year data set does not include those that graduated in 6. So they either graduated in 6 or they graduated in 8. For a while we put them together to test a few things, but really we wanted to test the graduated in 8 but not 6 separately to get a cleaner break on the data. Okay? All right, and so a little bit more about the data. So we had the traditional academic history variables that you would get in most institutional research databases in terms of how many semesters they attended, how many credit hours, what's their GPA, and so forth. And we had a little bit of demographic information, basically their birthday and their home county and a few things there that we had access to. And then we pulled in a lot of secondary data. Some of these were calculated. Some of these were linked or inferred based on where they were from. And so the demographic variables, as you might guess, focuses on what we know about them, their gender, their age, and so forth. Their academic history is, again, how they interacted, what semesters they attended, how long they attended before they dropped off, and so forth. We had some institutional profile variables, and so we took some metrics from each institution to use as control variables, and we looked at some of those. Additionally, some sociographic information. And so this is information about where they come from, about the environment that they grew up in from a sociological perspective. And so what we did have for at least all the students that registered from North Carolina, we had a listing of their most recent home county from where they applied from. And so we looked at their home county and pulled in a lot of secondary sources of data from government and or other websites that had a lot of statistics on them to see if some of them were predictive or might be predictive of how they would perform. And then in addition to that, we also looked at career prospects. And so we did a CIP code to SOC, looking at the career outcomes per government databases and other things for a likely major. So we looked at their major, and we looked at how employable that major was, how much in demand, and then we looked at anticipated salary for somebody in that degree with a little bit of experience in what the anticipated salary was to see if that would be predictive as well. So again, we had 5 categories of variables. After we did brought in all the secondary sources of data, we had about 160 variables that we analyzed on this data set, a lot of secondary sources to try to predict this. So again, roughly 160 variables. And then for this presentation, we're also breaking it down by Carnegie class. So we can look at some of the differences between the types of schools to see how students perform depending on what type of school they're at. So we'll have our research schools, our master's level schools, our bachelor level schools, and then we also did an additional analysis on historically minority focused schools to see what might be different across the groups. In addition, we have an overall model that includes all UNC schools that we'll also show statistics for today. Okay? So a little bit more about the project. I have a lot more about our methodology in the appendix. Again, I'm happy to share that. But really what we're trying to do is when we think about analytics here at the Care Center and others, we think about it as a pyramid. Or since we're at Appalachian, we might say as a mountain. Okay? And really the first level is this diagnostic phase. And that's, descriptive phase. And that's really trying to understand some of the data and what's in there and get your head wrapped around that and looking for maybe some basic statistical significance testing. And that's what we presented at the Adult Learner Convening, which I understand many of you were at in March, was sort of that analysis. And then the next level is what we call the diagnostic phase, is really trying to understand what might be causing what, looking deeper into the theory, trying to better understand what we see that might give us clues for how to predict things. And we did a report that is on the UNC General Administration website at this web link, and I'm sure Samantha can share that if there's interest. But at this website, there is a link to that report that we did on that deeper analysis. And then again, today we're trying to reach the third level of the mountain or pyramid, where we're trying to look at, can we know in advance what is likely to happen? And so there's several reasons we might want to know something in advance. One, if we develop a predictive model, it'll tell us a little bit about how important a variable is in terms of indicating what is likely to happen. Okay, that is not necessarily the same thing as causation. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it's not, but it's usually highly correlated with it, and something maybe a little easier to measure. And so they can identify things that are important that may give you warning that something is likely to happen. And so that advanced warning is important. It helps you with resource allocation, business metrics, an opportunity to intervene and help that student perhaps a little sooner if you can flag them in the system based on some behaviors or characteristics, and being a little more focused and accurate. And also it can influence policy, right? If you understand the things that might predict when things are going to happen, you might adjust your policies to sort of focus on how do you improve those things or watch for those things, and maybe change your practice a little bit with the hope of improving retention. Okay? Now again, I mentioned this briefly, but a lot of prediction is founded on correlations. Now we did do some diagnostic, we did bring in theory as well, but again, let's not confuse a predictive variable necessarily with causation. Often they are correlated, they may or may not be causal, sometimes they're reflective, but they are associated in a very powerful statistical model, meaning they generally tend to move together, but it may be something outside the model that's moving both of those things. Okay. Also, one thing that you have to be very careful of when doing a predictive model is what we call target leaks. And so when we have a data set of 13, 14 years worth of data, when we get that data raw, very often there's outcome data in there beyond just the target of yes or no. Did they finish or graduate or other things? And so if you look at, the number of semesters of attendance or any number of things that could be in there, there's a lot of things that could throw that off. So we had to control for target leaks. The way that we did that for this data set is we made sure that when we did our predictive model, we only had the data that would have been available to somebody doing an intervention at the time of their first stop out when they were a junior, senior year. So when a student comes and they take a stop out, that their very first one as a junior or a senior, that is the only data we fed the model, plus the target variable of did they eventually graduate or not, or stop out or not. And so that helps you have focused data that is actionable, because everything that we know or everything that our model knows are things that somebody could have known or would have known at the time of that first stop out if they would have looked through a little bit of data about the person. Okay, so that makes it a little more actionable. Again, sometimes when you do predictive analytics, it can appear to be a black box, and there are algorithms that are much more that way, and there are some that are less that way. The way we approach this is we tried to use algorithms that were a little bit more understandable. And so we used one that's it's a random forest, which is a collection of a bunch of decision trees, thousands of them, that I don't want to get into the statistics in this part of the presentation, but certainly we can share those with you. But it's one that's a little more understandable and gives clearer rules that says that, if a student is this age and they have this many credit hours and there's this other condition, this is their probability of coming back and finishing. Okay? And so again, we've picked models that can be explained a little bit more easily. We do have the rule sets for each school in the UNC system, and so if anybody wants them for their school, you are welcome to contact us, and we would be happy to share those with you. Conceptually, here's some of the key model statistics. We've optimized this model really more for, this is a technical term, but more for specificity, which is correctly predicting those that did not graduate, because we wanted to err on the side of can we help somebody that's at high risk. And so we've optimized the model to be the best at predicting those that are at high risk and identifying those. And this is the most actionable, and there's key statistics you could look at. Again, we don't want to make this a statistical presentation, but I have them. I'm happy to share them with anyone or discuss them later. But of course, you have accuracy, which is your total correct over your total. Specificity is the true negatives. That's the ones you got right when you said they were at risk. And then your sensitivity, which are the true positives, which are how did you do just for those that you said would graduate out of what they did. And again, we optimized for this one because we thought this was the most actionable, is if somebody's at risk, I want to do something about it, let's optimize for that. Okay? And so we tested the 6-year model and the 8-year predictive model around graduation. The 6-year model had very good statistics. It's a very strong model, especially when you're dealing with people, and people can be sometimes hard to predict, and there's lots of reasons people do things and so forth. And so we really focused on the 8-year, and so more than 4 out of 5 times we can predict if they're going to graduate in 6 years. Has very high specificity. The 8-year model was weaker. Now remember, the 8-year model did not include those that graduated in 6. It only included those that graduated in 8 years. And this really suggested to us that even though we had 160 variables, we tried lots of algorithms over lots of different schools over more than a decade of data. And there were some interesting things in there, and I would like to talk about that later, but the overall model predictive ability was less than the 6-year model. And so we wanted to focus more on the 6-year model. I think this is good for a number of reasons, but also catching people early and getting them in and seeing what's important there, I think will also help the 8-year rates. And again, some interesting things there, but it suggests that there's many diverse and elusive reasons for these 8-year students that are harder to predict in a statistical model. There's a lot of things that influence that. Life happens. Maybe they have a baby, maybe they have an illness, maybe they have other things which are not encoded in the data. Or maybe grit or other things may matter particularly well for this group. Okay? And so again, we're going to focus on this. We think this is more actionable. It has a lot of predictive power and things that we can influence. And so in the next few slides, we're going to show 2 types of slides. The first one is going to be for each of the 5 types of variables we have. We'll first show a variable importance slide. And what this will do is this will show which variables were important to the model, which ones gave the most predictive power, and we're just showing the best few from each category. Okay? And the way the model works is the most important variable is given a score of 100, being that's the most important variable to the model, and then every other score in that model or in that category is given as a percentage of its impact compared to the strongest variable in the model. Okay? And so we'll go ahead and look through that. And again, all other models are represented in terms of relative importance to the strongest or most predictive variable of the outcome. And so we'll show that, and we'll break it down by the 5 categories: demographic, sociographic, academic history, and so on. Okay? And so let's start with our demographic variables. And so the question is, what demographic variables are most important to predicting a stopout? Okay? And so you can see that the single most important across all models, almost all universities, all the data sets, was their age at their first stop out. And so this was 100%, meaning this was the strongest, most predictive model, is how old they were when they had their first stop out. And so we'll talk about that. Another one, which was not as important but still useful, was their age at their first matriculation. How old were they when they took their first university classes? And then there's some on financial aid. You can see it's very important for our minority students over here at 35% of this one. Less important to the bachelor degree granting institutions down to about 9% importance, but nonetheless important overall. And then driving time. How far away are you from home? Was a very important one. You may have heard this back in March. We've put this in the predictive model. Okay. So let's go ahead. We'll talk about each of these, but I wanted you to see how they ranked against each other in terms of their predictive power. So again, 100 is the most powerful variable in terms of generating a prediction score, and the other ones are all a percentage of that for that model. Okay? And so if we look at their age at first stop out, here's what we see. Okay? So over here, if we take the younger students that are 18 to 21, there's about 5,000 students in this group. If you look at this, the students that had their first stop out between 18 and 21 years old are much more likely to come back and graduate. So a key message, let me emphasize this right here. The younger a person is when they have their first junior, senior stop out. So this stop out occurred after they already had at least 60 credit hours. So that first junior, senior stop out was much more likely. You can see for the master's level schools, this mattered a lot. If you were less than 21 when you had your first junior, senior stop out, 43% of them, almost 44, came back and graduated. Okay, which for a Partway home student, that's a pretty big number. A little less on the minority schools, 25%. But I think the trend is, if they're younger, the chance is almost double. And then if you get up into older than 30, it's almost 3 times. The younger students are about double the ones 21 to 24, and they're about 3 times as many as those over 30. And so the key thing here for the first variable in the model is the younger they are when they have the stop out, the easier it is for them to recover and to return and to finish. And if you think about it, that's before a lot of life happens, right? Sometimes life gets in the way of college. And so again, the younger they are, they can be up to 3 times as likely to come back and finish a degree, especially for the master's and R1 schools. And all schools overall, you see the same trend. 3, again, almost 4, not quite 4 times as much as the 30, over 30 group, okay? Additionally, one of the other very powerful variables from a predictive standpoint is the estimated age at the first term. This is the first term they took college credit. We estimated this in some cases by taking the number of credit hours and their age and doing an estimate of when they started taking credit hours. And so if they started taking classes younger than 18, which means they took classes, college classes in high school, most likely, college classes in high school for most of these 6,000 students, they had a higher graduation rate for most groups. Your research schools, your master's level schools, and your bachelor level schools. 18 to 21, sort of the traditional age, was still pretty good, 19 to 20% of them graduating. The older they get, it starts to drop off, 14, 13, 10 as you're older. So again, starting school younger, particularly for those partway home, gives time to recover. Now, one interesting thing is for the minority schools, minority-focused schools, that's actually our lowest graduation rate of those that had the high school college. We did check, there's 837 people in this group, but for whatever reason, those people, it did not work the same way. It was significantly less than the rest of the groups for that started early. I don't know why, but that's what the data suggests. Okay. Another factor, financial aid, comes up. And so let's talk a little bit about how financial aid affects the graduation. And so one thing that was predictive was the number of terms of financial aid they had at their first stop out. Now remember, their first stop out, they would have had to have at least 60 credit hours for us to count it as a junior or a senior. Okay? And so if it was at 4 semesters below, they had a reasonably high return rate in the 20 percentile, but not really that much different than the 4 to 7 semesters. What is interesting, if they had completed 8 or more semesters, which means they would have had at least enough semesters that they theoretically could have graduated, okay, using a traditional model, it drops in by more than half their percentage. And so if they had that many terms of financial aid, and then they took their stop out, they were very unlikely to come back and finish. And so I found that to be very interesting for this group. Again, if they would have had 4 years essentially of financial aid and still had not finished and decided to take, for whatever reason, 1 or more semester off, then they were much less likely to come back, down in the 8 to 10% range, 6% for the minority schools. Okay? And so maybe financial aid is running out, maybe there's other issues, maybe they didn't really gel. A lot of things could be going on there, but nonetheless, if they've been having financial aid, which means they've probably qualify on some socioeconomic scale for financial aid throughout their college, and they still haven't finished after 4 semesters, that return and graduation rate drops off significantly.
4 years.
At that time, if they had 4 years of college, their 6-year graduate, 4 years of financial aid, their 6-year rate drops. Okay, this one was very interesting to me, and this was, we looked at driving time, okay? And so how far are you away? Now, we had to use a proxy for this. The proxy was the home county, and we picked the capital of their home county to get a rough measure of how long, and then we plugged into Google's API to calculate driving time. So it's not just distance, it's freeway driving versus back roads driving, but it's the total driving time. How long does it take you to get home, or at least to your home county, from where you are attending school? And this was interesting. Basically, now this was only for North Carolina students that we computed driving time. We did not compute it for the international students or the others, though conceivably that would be longer. But up to a point, the farther away, and by the way, the darker the cell, the more significant it is, if you haven't picked up on that by now. And so the farther away that your home place is, the higher your graduation rate. Okay? So at least for the Partway home students, understand we only had data from Partway home students. And so we're not saying for all students, but for those that had 1 or more semesters of stop out in their junior, senior year, the farther away they were from their hometown, the more likely they were to graduate. And so you can see a difference for all schools of, if you're less than an hour away from home, 14% up to 20%. The research schools didn't matter. 15%, 16%, it's all about the same. So for the Research 1 schools, that population is probably a little different. Master students is where we see a really big effect, going from 13 to 23, almost double if you're 2 hours or 3 hours away. Bachelor, we see the same thing. Minority schools, no effect. It's all 10. And so the minority schools, it didn't matter. The research schools, it didn't matter. But for the bachelor and master schools, you were almost twice as likely to graduate if you were farther away. And what we think's going on here is a couple of things. One is when you move 2 or 3 hours away from home, then you loosen your home social network and you're forced to form a new social network at the new school, sort of Tinto's framework, I'm sure many of you are familiar with, that gets you more socially integrated into your new school, as opposed to if you're in your hometown, you may keep your own network and not really be as emotionally invested. We also think there might be a commitment factor going on, such that you're making a conscious decision to move 2 or 3 hours, and really about 2 hours you get most of the effect. At 3 or more hours, but still within North Carolina, so it tops out at 5 or 6 hours depending on where you're from. But that new social network seems to be really important in terms of increasing graduation rate. And so I found that to be a very interesting finding. Okay, so now let's turn to academic history. What can we tell from looking at their transcripts? And so let's look at a few interesting things here. So not surprisingly, one of the most important variables that we have is their GPA at their first stop out. Okay, so did they stop out for academic reasons? Of course, we screened them. They all had at least a 2.0 GPA. Did they stop out for academic reasons, or did they stop out for other reasons? And so GPA at first stop out is very important, almost as important as age for most of them. And in fact, for the bachelor's level schools, it's tied essentially with age as the most important variable in terms of predicting whether they will return and graduate in a reasonable period of time. Okay. Also predictive, hours at stop out, you can see for minority schools, 50%, 49%, very important variable right there. Less so for the masters, but for the bachelor's and research schools, you're all in the 40s in terms of the importance to the predictive model. Okay, so the hours, how many hours they completed when they stop out matters. We'll unpack that in a minute. The number of semesters they've attended, correlated but not quite the same thing as the number of hours that stop out, the number of semesters. Again, interestingly, for bachelor student, hours matters a lot. The number of semesters matters very little. Master schools, it's for both of them, it's not very significant. And then your GPA trend. This is not the absolute GPA. This is the GPA going up or is it going down? And so we calculated that over the 3 semesters prior to the semester that you were stopped out, and we looked at it by increasing or decreasing over that time period to see if that would be predictive. And in fact, it was predictive, and for some schools, particularly the research schools, that GPA trend was a very important, and you might think of some reasons why the research schools, that GPA perhaps might be more important than some of the other schools. Okay? So let's look at each of these. So the first one, their GPA at the first stop out. And you can see if we start here in the master's level students, you can see, again, a nice trend. If your GPA is between 2.0 and 2.5, recall that we cut off at 2.0. So everybody in this data set had at least a 2.0. There was 12,000 students with between a 2.0 and a 2.5 GPA in this data set, almost half of the data set, a little less. And that's the lowest percentage. You're looking at anywhere from 6 to 10% of those students actually came back and finished in the time period of the study. But for those that had a 2.5 to 3.0, they were twice as likely as those between a 2.0 and a 2.5 to actually come back and finish. So just having your GPA above a 2.5 makes you about twice as likely. And at least for the master's student, if you're a 3.0 or higher, 32% of those students came back and graduated, and you're 3 times as likely to finish as somebody with a 2.48 versus a 3.5 or higher in here, being almost 3 times as likely. Less pronounced on the bachelor level, certainly an increase, big increase, but it tends to level off after about the 3.0 for the research and the minority schools. But for the masters, because that was such a high effect, we took an end count. There's over 2,000 out of the 5,000 in this master's group. That's a pretty big number for this, and so that is very statistically significant in terms of master's level schools. If they have a 3.5 or higher, there's a pretty good chance they'll come back and finish compared to the other ones. But less than a 2.5, not very likely to come back and finish. Okay? Additionally, if we look at the hours at the first stop out, this is how many credit hours. Remember, this is not the same thing as number of semesters. Number of semesters might include high school, college, or the number of semesters does not include that. It only includes the UNC. And so they may have more hours because they may have taken credit hours in high school. And so if there's 60 to 89 hours, basically you're juniors, okay? When they have their first stop out, they are the most likely to come back. You can see where it's a little darker here. If they're seniors, 90 to almost 120, still pretty good. Not as good as the juniors, but still pretty good. But if they had 120 hours or more when they had their first junior, senior stop out, they're not coming back. These are some of the lowest numbers we've seen, 5-6% of them. So even though they have 120 hours, even though they have 120 hours there, if they stopped at that point, that close to the finish line, they're just not likely to finish. Okay? All right, number of semesters also important. So if they're in this 4 to 5 semesters, this is kind of the sweet spot right here. And so you can see 30% for the master's level schools. If they were below 4 semesters, so that means if they were a Partway home student, they might have had a fair amount of credits. They were not too bad at the master's, but at the minority and bachelor's level schools, it was pretty low. And if they had 10 or more semesters, these are the lowest. We're down here at 3 and 4% if they had 10 or more semesters, and they just give up, essentially, many of them. Okay? All right, let's look at GPA trend. No surprise here. The higher your GPA, if your GPA is going up, at least within reason, and you're at a master's or a research school, if your GPA is going up, you're more likely to finish. Interestingly, that's true for all of these, but basically if that GPA trend is up and improving, you're more likely. If it's dropping, you're less likely. Okay? All right, institutional variables. The single most important, we tested about a dozen or so of these institutional variables. The one that really seemed to matter was the cost of attendance. This is not just tuition. This is the total estimated cost that each university has published on their website. And so let's unpack that a little bit. And actually, the most expensive schools in terms of cost of attendance had the highest graduation rate. Selectivity may play into that in terms of who comes into those schools. But that did make a difference. Okay? And so again, the more expensive schools, maybe they have more services, maybe they're more selective. But once you're past 18,000, that was for the master's schools almost double and then triple again for the master's level schools. The bachelor's were about the same, minority was about the same. This was really just the research and master's schools. Okay? Let's talk about our sociographic variables. Again, these were based on the home county of where the student was from. And so median household income of the home county was important, particularly to minority schools, unemployment rate, and the percentage of people in that home county that were in poverty. These are good proxies for socioeconomic status. Maybe not of that particular student, but at least of the community that they grew up in, okay, which we can infer a little bit at least. And so median household, no surprise here. If you were from a wealthy, relatively wealthy county, you were more likely to graduate. We did more than just break these into tier 1, 2, and 3. We actually had a value for each home county from the government statistics. Okay, this was particularly true at master's students, where if you were 20% higher than the average median income, you were twice as likely to graduate if you were at 80% or below of the state average household income, if you were from that home county. Also true of bachelor's, a little bit true of research. Minority, almost no effect, if not perhaps even just a little bit drop. Okay, so that was interesting. Okay, the unemployment rate, again, this is the unemployment rate of your home county, and it echoes what we had before. For the research schools, the higher the employment rate or the lower the unemployment rate, the more likely you are to graduate, going from 13% to 21%, 15 to 19 for the research schools. But we see almost, not exact, but we see almost the opposite effect for bachelor's level in minority schools, suggesting that perhaps there's a unique service that these schools provide, particularly for these type of students from the poor and the rural, highly stressed counties, that the worse off their county was, the higher the unemployment rate. Almost for those schools, bachelor's and minority schools, they were almost more likely to stay and graduate from those schools. Very different from the research and the master's level schools. So I thought that was interesting. Here's poverty rates. We see very similar trend as you might expect. The lower the richer the county, the more likely, again, the research and master's schools to graduate, but opposite trends almost for the bachelor's and minority. Again, reinforcing the idea that those schools, those bachelor's in minority schools, may be hitting a unique niche among those poorest students from at least the poorest areas of the state to be able to thrive. And so that was very interesting to me to see our predictive models pick up on that. Okay. Also, we looked at career prospects. This is, again, based on their last known major at the time of their stopout, based on the last major at the time of the stopout, translating that into employment outcomes. What mattered, and we can see two of these were kind of important to the model, useful, their prospective salary that they would have, and then what's the change in employment? Is it a growing field or is it a shrinking field? And so this was interesting. Let's go ahead and look at this. And so if their degree was likely to yield an income of less than $40,000, they weren't very likely to graduate. Most of them could make close to that by working hard without a degree. Okay? And so if they saw that they would spend all this time in school and they would get a degree that would not pay more than $40,000, that really hurt their chances to graduate. You can see 5% down in the minority column that were in this less than 40, and 10 or 12% for the research and bachelor's. So again, income mattered, particularly if it was below a threshold. Now, we do see some increase in the research and master's school, though the 40 to 50 is pretty high. These are all fairly stable. And the bachelor's, we kind of see a slow rise from 9 to 21.5%. The bachelor schools, it really, after you get above 40, it's all about the same. And so this is what we would call a threshold variable. And so if you are below some minimum threshold, it really hurts your prospects. If you're above it, it may help you marginally to go up above it. That's fine. We're not saying salary is everything. But if you're, why go spend all that time at school if you're making the same you could waiting tables or working construction, or perhaps even less? Okay. And so certainly that mattered a lot. We also looked at percentage employment. This one was very interesting. If there's a drop in employment, if the projected demand is going down for your major, then you were less likely to graduate. If you're doing something that's going out of style, if you have a 0 to 3 or 3 to 4% growth, it's about average, you know, a little bump, but really about the same. If it's higher than 4% growth, this was really interesting. If it's really a high in-demand growth area, We actually see a drop again, particularly at the master schools, and it may be that these students are taking jobs. I'm thinking computer science or some of the other ones that could be high demand. Perhaps they're getting lured away before finishing their degree to take jobs if it's growing too fast. And so really you want a nice, good, healthy growth, but not so much that somebody's lured away out of their last year in college and does not finish. And so that was interesting. So again, summarizing some of the key things, age matters, okay? The younger you can catch them, the earlier you can catch them. Early college seems to really help. Having that stop out earlier before life happens, there's more chance to recover. If somebody has a stop out later, it could be any number of family reasons or childcare reasons or work reasons. It's harder for them to come back. How many hours they earn, their GPA matters. Are they doing well in school? Is it at least above a 2.5? That seems to really matter as well if they have a reasonable GPA. Younger students, more likely they are to graduate. Long-term performance on your GPA really seems to matter and be a better indicator than hours and semesters. Short-term performance is predictive. Students with fewer hours are more likely to come back, correlated with being younger, but they have more of a chance to come back, whereas those very last ones, maybe they're a little jaded, maybe they're not so excited about college anymore, maybe the degree isn't what they thought it would be. And also, really important from the driving time and some of the other things we've seen, this social integration really seems to matter, and we think that's why driving time is important. Partly from commitment, but partly because if you're severing your old ties by being too far away to hang out with your buddies every Friday, you're going to form new friends, you're going to be more committed to the college. That really seemed to matter. Of course, as with any study, there's some limitations. Target leaks and the fancy word here, non-stationarity, that basically means over a 10 or 12 year period, economies change, attitudes change a little bit, but nonetheless, some very interesting data on a very large, reasonably sized data set. Okay. So we think the next phase, certainly we want to go back and work with the 8-year model a little bit more. We think there's some interesting things that we've seen there that we did not have time to share today. Things like the month somebody was born seems to be predictive for some groups, or other things that we can talk about at another time. But really where we want to go is getting into this prescriptive phase. If you remember the pyramid, what can we do to change it? How can we guide these analytics? And I think that's very important. And getting additional data. So again, we understand that you guys are the boots on the ground, that the people watching this webinar are the ones that by and large work with these people. We salute you. We appreciate what you're doing. We just hope that we can give a little bit more insight to some of the things that you are seeing. And if there's anything else we can do, or you have follow-up questions, we are here and happy. You can reach us at CARE, Center for Analytics Research and Education, care@appstate.edu, and we care, pardon the pun. But we would be happy to help any way we can if any of you want to follow up on any issues. And I believe we have 10 or 12 minutes for questions. And I would be happy to entertain any questions we have at this time. Okay. If there are no questions, I'm going to show my academic slides just because I spent a lot of time making them. So please, if you have a question, speak now. This is.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Yes, this is Derek Marr from East Carolina University.
Hi, Derek.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. You sent us this PowerPoint. Appendix was mentioned. Also, I'm not sure I have the term correct, but rule sets for each, for our campus, for East Carolina.
Yes, we could certainly do that. What I will do is I will share this slide deck and the appendix with Samantha. I assume she will have some way to mail it to anyone. And Derek, if you or any of the others would send an email to care@appstate, we'll pull that rule set and send it to you, and we'd also be happy to sit down and talk through it with you and help you understand it if you would like.
That sounds great. Thank you very much for the presentation.
All right. Thank you, Derek. Are there any other questions or comments? Okay. Just a little more about the variables here. 160 variables. We ran hundreds of models. And I don't know that I want to go too much into that, but there are some interesting statistics there in the appendix. Okay. I don't want to confuse anybody with. Dr. Spalding, did you have a question?
A comment that maybe you could elaborate on a little bit.
Yes.
So as we look at these, as I look at it and try and think from the perspective of somebody making decisions based on this,
yes,
is I'm looking and saying, okay, then if I know that the younger students are more likely to come back, where should I spend my efforts? At the older students or the younger students? And maybe that's getting a little bit onto the prescriptive side, but that's the questions that I'm having as I go through it.
And I think there's ways that this could be used. I think to do it well, you really need to do some testing and see. And the question is, do you spend time up with those that are more likely to come back, hoping you'll get a greater yield from the younger students, or do you spend more time on those you're more likely to lose? And in some ways, that could be an interesting question as well. And so it's optimizing that. And I think some experiments on that, some setting it up, some trying different things, and it may be different for different types of schools. And so the first stage is to predict, and can we tell with a reasonable degree of accuracy who's likely to finish or not, and then can I better allocate my resources. Certainly enrollment management can help with that, so you make sure you fill up your seats to capacity and help as many as you can. But that cost-benefit analysis would really take some nice investigation. I'd be happy to work with that on somebody if anybody on the call is interested, but I think that's what it would take. Any other questions or comments? Samantha, are you online? All right. If there's no more questions or comments, I guess we'll go ahead and wrap up. Thank you, all of you, for being here today. If you do have any questions or comments that you think of later or would like the rule set or anything else, please send us an email at care@appstate.edu. Thank you.
And sorry, Joe. Yes, I am here, and I just wanted to thank everybody for joining today. And certainly, if there's questions or this has sparked some thoughts that you'd like to discuss further, don't hesitate to reach out to Joe or I.
Can I throw in a question before we close down?
Rick, go ahead.
So all these students who are accumulating 120 hours, do you know if any of these reverse transfer programs that GA has been working on has helped them at least get their associates, or that actually surprised me a little bit.
I don't have the answer to that. Samantha, have you seen anything on that? Were you able to hear the question?
I was, yeah. We haven't mapped the students in our Partway home data set back to students in our reverse transfer data set to see how many of those students may have received a degree through reverse transfer. I think in general, yes, there probably are students in that category that either could have benefited from reverse transfer or who have benefited from reverse transfer.
And we did not look to see if they got an associate's after attending. We looked to see if they got a degree. Now we did, I know some students might transfer from a UNC school to a private school, so we did screen out anybody that went to Duke or Wake, and if they got their degree there, we did not count them as not having graduated. We did go through and clean the data set that way. And so if they graduated with clearinghouse data at a U.S. school with a bachelor's degree, we did adjust that so it would not throw off our statistics, but we did not look for associate's degrees. All right, thank you, Samantha. Thank you for everybody on the call for being here. And again, we're happy to follow up if anybody has questions.